My stepkids told me I had no say in the house I paid for. When I married Linda, I convinced myself that patience and consistency could heal any wound, bridge any gap, and even make strangers into family. I was 44, not a boy chasing illusions, but a man who had already tasted divorce, who had sworn never to repeat the same mistakes. I had 2 children from my first marriage, Sarah, 11, bright and sensitive, and Josh, 9, gentle yet already learning to guard himself from the coldness of the world. They had lived through the collapse of their mother and me, and I owed them stability. Linda seemed like that stability, and I believed that with her came not only a partner but a chance at a family reborn. Linda had her own children. Ashley, 17, old enough to know the full weight of her words and the sharpness of her silence. And Connor, 15, too clever for his own good, hiding behind sarcasm and smirks as if they were shields. They had lived most of their lives with their father before Linda and I married, and I thought naively that if I stepped in with generosity, with structure, with the simple act of showing up, they would see me as more than just the man who had taken their mother's hand. So I gave. I gave until my own children would sometimes look at me with confusion, as if they wondered why I poured so much into kids who didn't even want it. I paid for their private school tuition, thousands of dollars that could have built savings for Sarah and Josh's future. I signed checks for Ashley's language courses, Connor's soccer leagues, the endless extracurriculars that seemed designed to drain a man's wallet while promising his children a competitive edge in life. I bought the newest phones, the laptops they swore were necessary for schoolwork, the headphones, the shoes, the subtle forms of status that teenagers wield like weapons against each other. I cooked dinners after long workdays, believing that a table filled with warm food might feel like a table filled with family. I sat in the bleachers at Connor's games, shouting his name until my throat ached, though he never once looked my way after a goal. I applauded Ashley at her choir recitals, stood with flowers at the end, even though she brushed past me as if the bouquet had been handed by a stranger on the street. But there are some walls you cannot climb, some locks that no amount of kindness can turn. Ashley and Connor made their position clear from the beginning. I was not their father. I was not family. I was an outsider occupying a space they never wanted me to enter. Ashley carried herself like a queen whose throne had been threatened. She would lounge on the couch scrolling her phone while I asked her, politely, always politely, to help set the table. She wouldn't even shake her head. She would simply glance toward her mother, her eyes flicking for confirmation that my words held authority. If Linda echoed the request, Ashley would rise, irritated, dragging her feet. If Linda stayed silent, Ashley stayed rooted, her silence louder than defiance. Connor made his resistance into theater. At dinner, if I cooked, he would lean back in his chair, fork suspended, and ask Linda with exaggerated seriousness, "Is it safe? Did Thomas really make this?" Then he would smirk when his mother sighed, and Sarah's small shoulders would shrink a little more in her chair. One evening, he leaned toward my daughter and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Your dad isn't anyone here. He's just a stranger who pays the bills." Sarah's eyes had brimmed with tears, but she said nothing. She only clutched her napkin tight, as though silence was the safest choice. The cruelty wasn't always spoken. Sometimes it was in the way Ashley would close a door the moment I entered the room, or the way Connor would wait until Linda came home before asking permission for things I had already denied. It was in the shared smirks between them when I asked about homework, in the laughter that stopped when I walked into the living room, in the casual dismissal that wore me down not with fire, but with slow erosion. And Linda, my wife, the woman I had chosen to trust again after a failed marriage, stood so often in silence. She would sometimes rebuke them, but softly, as though afraid of pushing too hard. "They're teenagers," she'd murmur. "They're adjusting. Their father fills their heads with nonsense about loyalty. Just give them time." Time. That was the word she always clung to. But time didn't heal, it calcified. The longer I stayed silent, the more certain they became that their contempt was safe, that I would never push back, never draw a line. My children, Sarah and Josh, noticed it too. They grew quiet in ways children should not grow quiet, as though afraid their father's kindness would continue to be weaponized against him. One evening, after I had spent hours preparing dinner, Sarah offered to set the table. Ashley, sprawled across the couch, laughed and said, "Why bother? It's just Thomas's food." Connor snorted and Linda, God help her, did not speak. I stood there holding the serving dish, my son tugging gently at my sleeve, and I felt the invisible split of the household like a crack through the center of the floor. Two families under one roof. Two sets of children. Mine, who respected me but shrank under the weight of the tension. And hers, who mocked openly, shielded by their mother's reluctance to confront them. I was paying for the roof, paying for the schools, paying for every brick of the life we lived, and yet I was being carved out of it piece by piece. It wasn't rage that took root in me then. It was clarity. A slow, burning clarity that whispered, "This cannot continue." It all broke on a night that should have been ordinary. The dinner table was set. Sarah and Josh sat quietly, their plates waiting. Ashley scrolled her phone, Connor leaned back in his chair, and Linda filled the silence with small remarks about her day at work. I had cooked again, as I always did, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, the kind of meal that used to mean something in a family. I placed the platter down, carved the meat, and tried to keep the peace by pretending I didn't notice the smirk tugging at Connor's lips. He leaned toward Ashley and muttered something I couldn't catch. She laughed, short, sharp, cruel. "Is something funny?" I asked, not with anger, but with that weary tone of a man who has carried too many small humiliations. Ashley looked up then. She didn't laugh, didn't look away, didn't even soften her expression. She stared directly at me, her eyes cold, and said the words that shattered everything. "You're not our father. You're nothing to us." The air went silent. Forks froze. Even Connor looked surprised at her bluntness, but he quickly smirked again, proud of his sister's courage. Linda's lips parted, but no sound came out. Sarah dropped her gaze, and Josh stared at me with wide, searching eyes, as though waiting to see what his father would do. Nothing. That's what I did, at least in that moment. I didn't shout. I didn't slam my fist on the table. I simply finished carving the chicken, placed a slice on each plate, and sat down. I chewed my food like it was ash in my mouth, but inside something was ending. Something that had been fraying for months finally tore clean through. I went to bed in silence that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing Ashley's voice echo again and again. "You're not our father. You're nothing to us." It wasn't just a teenager's cruelty. It was the truth they had been living by all along, finally spoken aloud with no mask. And Linda, my wife, had sat there and let the words hang, offering no shield, no correction, no defense. By dawn, I knew what I had to do. The next morning, while the house still slept, I sat at my desk. I pulled open the drawer where I kept the paperwork, the bills, the receipts, the contracts. I looked at every line item, every payment that tied me to children who treated me like a ghost. Tuition invoices for Ashley's private school, Connor's soccer club fees, language courses, summer camps. All of it under my name. All of it drafted from my account. I dialed the first number. My voice was calm, even polite. "Yes, this is Thomas. I'm calling to inform you I will no longer be financially responsible for these accounts." I gave the student IDs, the program details. I told them to redirect bills to Linda or her ex-husband. I hung up, then dialed the next and the next. With each call, I felt a strange mixture of grief and liberation. Soccer. Cancelled. French lessons. Cancelled. SAT prep. Cancelled. After-school art program. Cancelled. Hours passed in that chair. My coffee went cold beside me. By noon, I had stripped myself of every obligation I had assumed for children who spat in my face. Then I dialed one last number, their father. I had spoken to him only a handful of times, always with the stiff politeness of men forced into proximity by circumstance. But this time, my voice carried no hesitation. "Since I'm nothing to them," I said, "their real parents can figure out how to pay for their education." There was silence on the other end, followed by a cough, then a stammered reply. I didn't stay on the line long enough to care. When Linda came home that evening, I was waiting at the kitchen table with the papers spread out before me. She set down her purse, confused at first, then alarmed when she saw the stack. "What is this?" she asked. "I've canceled everything," I said. My voice was steady, almost unnervingly so. "Their school, their activities, every privilege tied to my name. From this moment on, I will no longer pay for Ashley or Connor." Her face blanched, then reddened with anger. "Thomas, you can't just—" "I can," I interrupted. "And I did. Your daughter told me I'm nothing to her. Your son mocks me at every meal. And you—" I paused, feeling the bitterness rise. "You let it happen. So fine. If I am nothing, then I will act like nothing. I will no longer carry the weight of children who refuse to acknowledge me." She sputtered, pacing the kitchen, her voice rising into shrillness. "They're just kids. They don't mean it. You're being cruel, selfish." "Cruel?" I asked, leaning forward. "Cruel is telling a man in his own home, the man who pays for the roof, that he is nothing. Cruel is spitting on every sacrifice I've made. No, Linda, what I've done is not cruelty. It's justice. It's clarity." She grabbed at the papers, flipping through them as though sheer disbelief could undo the decisions. "You've ruined their future." "No," I said, standing. "I've given it back to the people who claim ownership of them. Their future belongs to you and their father. Let him pay for it. Let him shoulder the responsibility. He's their real father, isn't he? Isn't that what they wanted?" Her mouth opened, but no words came. Her hands trembled over the scattered papers, as if she could gather them up and piece the world back together. But the truth was written in ink, logged in phone calls, filed in systems that would not bend to denial. That night, Ashley stormed into the living room, her voice sharp with disbelief. "You canceled school? Are you insane?" Connor followed, his usual smirk replaced with unease. "You can't just do that. You don't control everything." I looked at them both, standing side by side, and I felt no anger, only the cool detachment of a man finally done being used. "I don't control you," I said. "I never did. You made sure of that. But I control my money. And my money is no longer yours." They stood frozen, their outrage tangled with fear, their confidence crumbling at the sudden realization that words had consequences, that disrespect had a price tag. Sarah and Josh watched from the hallway, silent, their eyes wide with something close to relief. For the first time in months, they saw their father standing tall, not shrinking beneath mockery. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The line had been drawn. The house turned into a battlefield. The night I cut off the money, Linda's fury burned hotter than I had ever seen. She followed me from room to room, her voice ragged, words spitting like sparks. "How could you do this to them? To me? Do you realize what you've done?" I said nothing at first. Sometimes silence is sharper than argument. But she pressed, her hands trembling, her eyes wide not with grief, but with outrage. "You've humiliated them," she shouted. "Ashley is terrified. She doesn't know if she can even stay in her school now. Connor's soccer team. Do you know what this does to his chances for college? You've ruined everything." Her words washed over me, but I stood still, anchored in the quiet certainty of my decision. Finally, I answered, "No, Linda, I didn't ruin anything. They did. With every insult, with every sneer, with every moment you let pass in silence." She froze at that, her lips parting as though to object, but she couldn't, because deep down she knew it was true. The children reacted as I expected, first with rage, then with disbelief, and finally with panic. Ashley stormed into my office 2 nights later, waving her phone as though it were evidence in a trial. "They called me from school. They said tuition isn't paid. Do you realize how humiliating that is? Do you even care?" I looked at her, the girl who had told me I was nothing, who had used her words like knives, now trembling because the world had finally answered her cruelty with consequence. "You said I'm not your father," I reminded her, my voice calm. "You said I am nothing to you. So why should I be the one paying for everything that makes your life comfortable? Her mouth opened, but no words came. Instead, tears welled at the corners of her eyes. Tears she quickly tried to blink away before they could fall. She spun on her heel and stormed out, but her silence said more than her shouts ever could. Connor lasted longer before breaking. He tried to hold on to bravado, mocking me still at dinner, muttering under his breath about power trips and control freaks. But when his coach called to say he was suspended from the team until fees were settled, his mask cracked. He slammed his bedroom door, cursed loud enough for the whole house to hear, then emerged hours later with red eyes. "You don't get it," he said, his voice hoarse. "Soccer is my life. Without it, I've got nothing." I looked at him steadily. "Then you should have thought about that before you told Sarah, I'm just a stranger in my own home." He flinched at that but said nothing more. Sarah and Josh, meanwhile, were different children. For the first time in months, they seemed able to breathe. Sarah no longer hunched her shoulders at dinner, waiting for insults to sting. Josh stopped asking why Ashley and Connor never listened to me. They watched as the balance shifted, as their father reclaimed the authority that had been mocked and dismissed. And though they didn't say it aloud, their small smiles told me enough. They felt safe again. Linda, though, she would not forgive so easily. She accused me daily of cruelty, of selfishness, of playing with children's lives like pawns. "You're punishing them for being kids," she cried one evening, her hands shaking as she set plates on the table. "No," I told her. "I'm teaching them that words have consequences." "You call me cruel? What do you call it when your son tells my daughter her father is nothing? What do you call it when your daughter spits in my face with her words? Cruelty is not mine, Linda. It belongs to them. I am only returning it." She wept then, not with grief, but with the desperation of a woman losing control of her carefully balanced world. And I let her cry, because some truths are too heavy for comfort. Days passed. The silence grew heavier. Ashley avoided me, her eyes downcast whenever we crossed paths. Connor sulked in his room. His sarcasm burned out, leaving only sulky quiet. Linda moved around me like a shadow, speaking only when necessary. Then the phone rang. It was her ex-husband. His voice was stiff, as though even he could not quite believe he was making this call. "They've been begging me," he said. "Ashley, Connor, they're desperate. Ashley admitted what she said to you was cruel. Connor, well, he says he mistook your kindness for weakness. They want to fix things." I let the silence hang for a moment. I wanted him to feel the weight of it, the long months of being mocked, the countless small wounds that had led here. Finally, I spoke. "If they want to fix things," I said, "then they need to understand the terms. Respect. That's it. They don't have to love me. They don't have to call me dad. But they will treat me with respect, as the man who has cared for them, as the adult who has carried this family. Without that, there is nothing to discuss." He was quiet, then sighed. "Fair enough. I'll tell them." When I hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone. I thought of Ashley's cold eyes, Connor's sneers, Linda's silence. And I thought of Sarah and Josh, who had watched me bend and bend until I finally stood straight again. That night, Linda asked what the call was about. When I told her, she seemed torn between relief and resentment. "So you'll take them back?" she asked. "Only if they change," I said. "Only if they finally see me as more than a wallet, more than a ghost." She didn't answer, but her silence carried a new weight. Hope, perhaps, or fear. For the first time in months, I felt the ground shifting. The war was not over, but the battle line had been drawn. And for once, it was not me retreating. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the tide began to turn. The first cracks appeared in Ashley. She had always carried herself like someone untouchable, impervious to consequence. But after the tuition cancellation, after the long silence that followed, she began to falter. One evening, she lingered at the doorway of my office, her phone tucked nervously into her hand. "I need help," she said, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. I didn't look up from my work at first. "With what?" "My application For this summer program, she murmured. I don't know how to write the essay. It was a small thing yet monumental. For the first time, she asked me, not her mother, not her father, me. I read her draft, offered suggestions, and she listened. Truly listened. When she left the room, she said something almost foreign in her mouth. Thanks. Connor took longer. His pride was thicker, his defiance more stubborn. But one afternoon, after his team had played without him for weeks, he came to me. He stood in the doorway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his jaw tight. You were right, he said finally. About what? About respect. About everything. I thought you'd just keep paying no matter what. I thought you'd never fight back. But you did. He looked down then, as if the floorboards could swallow him. I don't want to lose soccer, and I don't want you to hate me. I studied him for a long moment, the boy who had once mocked me in front of my own daughter, now trembling under the weight of his own admission. I don't hate you, Connor, I said, but I won't be disrespected in my own home, ever again. If you want me to support you, then you will treat me with the respect you would give any man who puts food on your table and a roof over your head. He nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief. The change was not immediate, but it was steady. Ashley began saying thank you when I drove her to school. Connor started clearing his plate without being asked. They were small gestures, yet they carried the weight of tectonic shifts. For the first time, I could walk through my own house without feeling like an intruder. Linda noticed, too. At first, she was wary, uncertain whether this fragile peace would hold. But as weeks turned to months, she saw her children beginning to soften, to reach toward me rather than away. One evening, after Ashley offered to set the table without being prompted, Linda pulled me aside. You were right, she admitted, her voice low, almost ashamed. I thought you were being cruel. But maybe you saved us. Her ex-husband even called one afternoon, his tone begrudging but sincere. They're different, he said, more careful with their words, more aware of themselves. I didn't think you had it in you, Thomas. But maybe it was the right call. That admission meant more than he knew. Respect from an ex-husband is a rare currency, and I took it for what it was, a recognition that boundaries had been necessary, that love without discipline is only indulgence. Sarah and Josh, my own children, thrived in the new balance. Sarah no longer wept in silence after Connor's barbs. Josh laughed again, freely, unguarded. They saw their father as someone who would not only protect them but demand fairness from all. That lesson was worth more than any extracurricular activity, any private school tuition. The real turning point came months later, when Ashley faced a crisis of her own. She had failed an important exam, and for the first time in her life, her confidence cracked. She came to me, not Linda, not her father, but me, and asked if I would help her study. I sat with her for hours, explaining concepts, drilling practice problems, pushing her harder than she expected. When she passed the retake, she looked at me not with disdain, but with something dangerously close to gratitude. Connor's moment arrived on the field. His coach had reinstated him after Linda and her ex took over the fees, but his performance faltered. Frustrated, he came to me late one night, his uniform still damp with sweat. Can you come to my next game? He asked quietly. I raised an eyebrow. Why? You've never wanted me there. Because. He hesitated, then exhaled. Because it matters. Because I play better when someone actually gives a damn. I went. And when he scored, for the first time he looked at me. Not at Linda, not at the crowd, but at me. It wasn't perfect. Old habits don't vanish overnight. There were still sharp words, still moments where Ashley rolled her eyes or Connor muttered under his breath. But there was also a difference, a pause, a hesitation, a memory of what had been lost and what could be lost again. They had tasted a life without my support, and they didn't want to return to it. Linda confessed one evening as we sat alone after the children had gone to bed. I was so afraid you'd break us, afraid we'd never come back from it. But you were the only one who saw the truth. That love isn't enough without respect. That family isn't real if it's built on contempt. Her hand found mine across the table, And for the first time in months, I felt not the distance of betrayal but the tentative bridge of understanding. The lesson was etched into me as deep as scar tissue. Love is not compromise without end. Love is lines drawn with steady hands. Sometimes the most caring act is not indulgence, but refusal. Not another sacrifice, but a demand. Respect had become the currency of our home. And unlike money, unlike tuition or sports fees, it could not be bought. It had to be earned, and it had to be given freely. And for the first time, I believed they were beginning to understand. Looking back, I carry no regret. People called my choice extreme, but it was the first time the ground beneath us was real. My stepchildren learned that love is not owed, respect is not optional, and that a home belongs to all only when its pillars are honored. I gave them a wake-up call, and in doing so, I saved myself. So tell me, was I wrong to draw the line, or was it the only way to rebuild what they had already shattered?